Welcome to this short lecture on climate change and polar marine ecosystems. My name is Dr. Laura Grange and I'm a lecturer in the School of Ocean Sciences at Bangor University. First and foremost, however, I'm a benthic marine ecologist, which means that my primary research interests focus on marine ecosystems and in particular the organisms that live at the seafloor. I also have a specialism in the polar regions. And as you can see from the photographs, I visited and undertaken research in some of the coldest, driest places on the planet. They are the Arctic and the Antarctic. And these trips have shown me that the polar regions are amazing places and that they are integral to our scientific understanding of how a changing climate is impacting marine ecosystems. But why do we study the polar regions? After all, the Arctic and the Antarctic are both very far away. They're also considered to be inhospitable places that experience extreme temperatures and seemingly harsh environmental conditions. For scientists, however, there are many good reasons why we study what happens at the poles, and this is very much the case for both ocean and earth scientists. So, to put this short lecture into a broader context, I'd like to begin by taking a step back and talk about some of the reasons why we study the polar regions and why the polar regions are indeed important. Well, firstly, the polar regions are the cornerstones of our remarkable global ecosystem. They are the health barometers of our planet, providing us with an early warning system against the greatest challenge of our time, which is climate change. They provide us with invaluable information regarding global processes, because the processes that occur in the Arctic and the Antarctic are intimately connected with the processes that occur around the rest of the world. So what happens in the Arctic and the Antarctic influences the living conditions elsewhere. The polar regions can also be considered regulators and drivers of the world's climate. For example, much of the weather that affects us here in Europe originates in the Arctic. Our climate models also show us that in the future the polar regions are anticipated to warm a lot faster compared to the rest of the world. So they are literally the hotspots of future climate evolution. And we're already observing change within these regions. So for example, Antarctic Peninsula glaciers are melting rapidly, and we're also seeing the spectacular breakup of large ice shelves. In addition, Arctic sea ice is retreating dramatically, and glaciers on Greenland are flowing much faster than they've been previously measured. Therefore, the polar regions offer an unparalleled natural laboratory for investigating fundamental questions in marine biology and ecology, especially with regards to environmental change and the impacts of climate warming. So for the rest of this talk, I'd like to focus in on the Antarctic. Now, the Antarctic is the last great wilderness on Earth. It's colder, windier, and more remote than anywhere else on the planet. And this formidable landscape covers an area twice the size of Europe, and 99% of the land is covered by ice and snow. However, 200 million years ago, Antarctica looked very different. At this time, the Antarctic continent was part of a large supercontinent called Gondwana, and this is an impression of what the Earth's surface would have looked like then. Over millions of years, the continents drifted away from one another, so much so that 75 million years ago, Antarctica drifted to its current position over the South Pole. At this time, the continent was still joined to South America, and in contrast to the cold glaciated climate that we recognise today, Antarctica was a temperate forest, and a large current that brought heat down from the tropics at that time provided a constant supply of heat that stopped Antarctica freezing, which allowed these forests and life to develop. Around 40 million years ago, South America moved northwards, and this led to the oceanographic and geographical isolation of Antarctica, particularly isolating Antarctica from the warming from the north. And it's this oceanographic isolation that led to the establishment of the unique landscape that we see today. And that's this landscape. So the Antarctic is a frozen continent surrounded by ocean, and this oceanographic isolation modified the landscape and the climate of Antarctica. It also led to the evolution of a unique marine environment. This unique marine environment is characterised by a background of low, stable temperature. The temperatures are lowest in the world's oceans at the polar regions. In addition to having extremely low temperatures, the polar regions also show low variability with respect to temperature. So variability is amongst some of the lowest recorded around the world, with the high Antarctic sites having an annual temperature variation significantly less than 1 degree C. Overlaid on this background of low stable temperature is a strong seasonal signal in primary production, which of course is performed by phytoplankton, which are floating microscopic marine algae that form the base of the food web. This seasonal signal in primary production is underpinned by extreme seasonality in sea ice cover, where we see a sea ice maximum during the winter and a sea ice minimum during the summer. So we have a background of low stable temperature which is sharply contrasted against by this strong seasonal signal in primary production and therefore food availability. So the oceanographic isolation of Antarctica and the development of a unique marine environment has led to a diverse array of polar marine organisms, many of which are known to be endemic, which means that they are only found in waters around Antarctica. The marine organisms that live at the seafloor in the Southern Ocean comprise the vast majority of the biodiversity that's known around Antarctica, something on the order of 80%, and most have evolved in the Southern Ocean over millennial timescales. They include giant isopods. Now these are similar to woodlice and the sea slater that we see on our shorelines. They also include sea spiders or pycnogonids, some of which show polar gigantism. These can be up to dinner plate size, so they will have something on the order of a 30 centimetre leg span, as well as these long ribbon worms or Nemertean worms. There are also a large number of other species, including marine mollusks, sea stars, brittle stars, sea cucumbers, marine worms, sea anemones, and also some fish. These fish, several of them, have evolved special antifreeze proteins in the blood that wrap around any small ice crystals, preventing them from growing and bursting cells. So these marine organisms live within a very small temperature window, and they're adapted to a narrow temperature range in temperature, anywhere between minus 1.8 in winter, which is the freezing point of seawater, to only plus 2 degrees C in the summer. They also experience this strong seasonal cycle in ice and sunlight that affects the food availability that they receive. So given these extreme conditions, how does life exist in the deep frozen south? Well, I've already mentioned that the animals that live at the seafloor in Antarctica live within this very narrow temperature window, and they're adapted to these very small temperature ranges. It therefore follows that they have a low thermal tolerance to temperature change. They are classed as being stenothermal. They have slow physiological rates and an extended life history compared to their temperate and tropical counterpart, which means that they live to greater ages. In terms of their physiological rates, their growth rates are reduced on the order of 2 to 5 times slower compared to temperate and tropical species, and the age at which they reach sexual maturity is also much delayed. Often Antarctic organisms won't reach a reproductive age until they're between 12 to 20 years of age. Their development rates are also slowed on the order of 2 to 20 times slower compared to their temperate and tropical counterparts. And in general, metabolic rates in Antarctic ectotherms are low compared to other latitudes. So overall, there is a slower pace of life in Antarctica, and this slower pace of life is very apparent in benthic activity levels. So these data show the rate of accomplishing various activities for a range of Antarctic marine invertebrates and fish, and those rates are compared to a relative rate for an ecologically similar temperate species, as indicated by the dashed line. So what you can see by looking at these data is that various activities, including walking in limpets, burrowing in anemones and mollusks, swimming in scallops and burst swimming in fish, as well as the drilling behaviour of predatory snails, are all markedly slower in the Antarctic compared to that temperate counterpart. There's one exception that's shown on this diagram. The exception is sustained swimming in fish that appears to be completely temperature compensated. That's owed to the fact that the red mussel in Antarctic fish has evolved to contain twice as many mitochondria as temperate species. So although the mitochondria in Antarctic fish work more slowly, the increased number of those mitochondria offsets this reduced capacity. So it's this slow pace of life and the low metabolic rates that we see commonly amongst Antarctic invertebrates that make them successful organisms in a seemingly harsh environment. So these unique fauna have evolved a diversity of weird and wonderful adaptations to survive and thrive in this frozen ocean. And these adaptations, as we've said, include antifreeze proteins in fish, but also weird and wonderful adaptations such as polar gigantism. But why do we see polar gigantism? Well, one of the common hypotheses refers to the oxygen hypothesis, where gigantism is thought to stem from the fact that there is high oxygen availability in the water column owed to its low temperature, and this coupled with low metabolic rates allows organisms to attain large body sizes. Other hypotheses are founded in biogeographic and ecological explanations, such as starvation resistance and the seasonal availability of resources, in that larger animals tend to be able to resist starvation better than their smaller counterparts. So with that in mind, why do we care? Why is the Antarctic an interesting and an important marine system to study, particularly in the context of climate change? Well, this figure that you can see in front of you shows the long-term changes in yearly surface temperature in and around Antarctica between 1981 and 2007. And these data have been collated by the NASA Earth Observatory. What these data show is that the Antarctic, and in particular the West Antarctic Peninsula, is currently undergoing a period of rapid warming. Now that warming has in fact expanded from the peninsula to now encompass most of West Antarctica, and although it's slightly offset by cooling in East Antarctica across certain regions, we now recognise there to be a continental-wide trend in terms of warming. And evidence that's actually supported that warming shows that sea surface temperatures around Antarctica, particularly over the West Antarctic Peninsula, have increased in temperature by a degree in the previous 50 years, so prior to being recorded. And that rate of warming is in fact unprecedented compared to previous records. So this temperature change is having a dramatic effect upon this frozen continent and the surrounding frozen ocean. So this region of rapid change offers scientists a unique opportunity to study the effect of climate change on marine biology. Remember that Antarctic organisms are extremely vulnerable to climate warming, and that's a consequence of their strict physiological limits and their slow physiological rates, which means they have a limited intrinsic physiological flexibility to cope with change. Therefore, responses to change are expected to be both sooner and larger in Antarctic organisms compared to their comparable temperate and tropical counterparts. So they really are barometers for change. And we're already seeing change in the Antarctic, particularly within these seafloor invertebrates. So the vast majority of Antarctic ectotherms, as we've said, live within narrow temperature ranges. And this compares to a range of 20 degrees C in the vast majority of temperate species. Now that's put into sharp contrast when we consider that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, predict that global seawater temperatures may rise on the order of 2 to 4 degrees in the next 100 years. And one of the factors that determines how organisms may respond to that change is their ability to acclimate. So acclimation to a new temperature is an indication of an organism's flexibility to cope with changing environmental conditions. And under normal conditions, animals will have a certain amount of capacity to cope with demand and to sustain their biological requirements. Any remaining capacity above that scope or spare capacity is used for other fundamental biological functions. And as the environment changes and those costs increase, the amount of spare capacity or scope reduces. And if that goes beyond the bounds of the normal biological capacity of an organism, its survival becomes limited. But what is the physiological mechanism that underlies this restricted ability to acclimate to temperature change? Well, it turns out that it's oxygen supply failure to tissues. And this is the major factor limiting the thermal tolerance of marine ectotherms worldwide, not just those found in the Southern Ocean. What this means is that as organisms approach that upper lethal temperature, they transfer from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, and their ability to survive depends upon their ability to withstand the accumulation of anaerobic products within their tissues. And that's illustrated here by these data that you can see on the right. So these data were collected For an Antarctic limpet, Nacella cancina, an Antarctic bivalve, Latinula elliptica, and the scallop Adimisium colbecki. And this study looked at fundamental biological functions, including writing in the limpet, reburying in the bivalve, and swimming in the scallop. What you can see for the limpet and the bivalve is that at 0 degrees C, almost 100% of the experimental population can perform their fundamental biological function. That drops to around 50% at 2 degrees C, and pretty much 0% at only 5 degrees C. And the response to warming is even more extreme within the scallop Adimisium colbecki, where at only 0 degrees C, around 50% of the experimental population can perform the activity, and at 2 degrees, no individuals could perform that fundamental biological function. Now, this has important implications at the population level, because it has implications for the ability of these organisms to perform fundamental functions, not just writing, reburying, and swimming, but functions such as feeding, digestion, and reproduction. So to conclude, the polar regions are considered the cornerstones of our remarkable global ecosystem. They are the health barometers of our planet, providing us with an early warning system for the greatest challenge of our time, which is climate change. Finally, the Antarctic and the seas around it are a natural laboratory in which we can investigate fundamental questions in marine biology and ecology. Insights from polar science therefore provide us with new knowledge. That knowledge is integral to our understanding of climate change with global implications. So for anyone that's interested in being part of polar science, particularly with respect to polar marine ecosystems, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.